So I'm Alex. Please excuse any foolish errors on our part. It is 5 a.m. here. I'm glad to see someone else engages only with the lore. I've never played the tabletop game either. I want to begin by thanking Dr. Ryder for helping organize this wonderful conference. I suspect many people here have a detailed background in the humanities, but I didn't. I majored in mathematics, and we both work in emergency services. So the point here, conceptually, we use, academics use their academic frameworks to analyze specific literary or artistic examples. So, as an example, the classical music riot is recreated and rendered in the Maraviglia, for example. I did not have this background, but what I did have was Warhammer. I do not think it is a revelation to anyone here at this conference that Warhammer, which can uncharitably be called a game about big space men with big space guns, has attracted a highly academic audience. I have therefore learned many of my analytical frameworks by reversing the lens, so to speak, which is what I'm here to discuss. So I consider what I know about Warhammer. I use that to think about theory. I assume that the reference to theory in Warhammer must have been intended by the authors. It seems pretty clear. So this talk is basically, at least for me, about the pedagogical application of Warhammer to literary theory, art history, and philosophy. I'm very grateful that Sarah managed to explain Adorno to me, even if she did have to resort to using big space men with big space guns. I'm a pre-med at CU Boulder, and I assume now is a very bad time to mention that my favorite character in the setting is Fabius Bile.
Uh, I'm Sarah, and I was already introduced, so I don't really need to go over that. I would say that, yeah, I also just read the lore, mostly play some video games. I initially was curious about Warhammer because of their use of the Latin language in Gothic and High Gothic. And then I started reading the lore, so yeah, I think other than the Mechanicus, I am more interested in Emperor's Children, Slanesh, and Night Lords. So we'll get started now. We began constructing a diachronic analysis, so we are presenting a few parts of this in our presentation since it got a bit long with all of it. But we want to just begin that work and do what we can in this brief amount of time to show how the 40K franchise functions as science fiction, where philosophical ideas and cultural beliefs about technology are inscribed and reinscribed over decades of time. So we've accumulated quite a few decades of 40K history at this point. So it's interesting to look at in sequence and at the Adeptus Mechanicus and how they've developed. So we'll be considering the changing views on technology and its relationship with humanity and how that's reflected in the AdMech from early depictions to the more recent depictions.
So crucially, we would like to treat 40K not as an allegory to be decoded through critical theory, but as a proof of theory. So we're seeking to treat 40K as a cultural artifact that demonstrates those philosophical dynamics in practice rather than to directly be analyzed with those dynamics.
So hopefully we'll be doing that and we won't keep reversing the order since I'm used to applying theory to things and going that direction. We're really trying to just show how 40K can be proof of theory for some of these concepts. So yeah, that kind of what we just said. Why did we choose the Adeptus Mechanicus? We chose them because they're a faction that we saw as being constantly and consistently redefined over the years. So they're an ideal subject for this sort of diachronic analysis. And each reimagining that we see of the Adeptus Mechanicus presents them slightly differently. So it's interesting to see how there are these core tensions that we run into repeatedly, like the questions of, is technology a tool of progress or is it a prison of ritual? Or are human beings liberated by our machines or are we ultimately subsumed by them? We see this both of these aspects embodied in the Adeptus Mechanicus, and on one hand, they can appear as idealizations of transhumanist futures that offer these visions of enhanced hybrid bodies and that transcend human limits, but they also can be viewed as grotesque spectacles of body horror in some instances where augmentation is erasing their individuality, their gender, humanity, other parts of their identity. So I think we'll see over time this tension between aspiration and dread is not resolved, and instead it's reinscribed in new forms. Um, the evolving portrayals, we believe, reflect shifting anxieties and desires within Western technoculture and include both aspects of that early optimism and empiricism and the seek for reason about human mastery over nature, and more modern fears about things like automation, AI, and post-human futures.
So, not having this really strong background in critical theory, I approached it more from the topic of, and analyzing it from the perspective of Warhammer. So, some of the things that I explored via Warhammer were, for example, like Adorno and Horkheimer, dialectic of enlightenment. So Adeptus Mechanicus, they were originally depicted per the Adeptus Titanicus rulebook from 1988. They were called research theologians and priest scientists. And over time, the research and scientific functions diminish and eventually become considered outright heretical, which is kind of an interestingly vivid reflection of Adorno and Horkheimer's works that are depict exactly this process. So you start with this rational mastery of man over nature, and you get a subsequent regression into myth, which is then calcified as ritual. Another source that we often refer to here is Barth's Mythologies. So the machine, is an outlet for human creativity, and like many other forms of art, such as the art we all enjoy pertaining to Warhammer, the machine is deeply entwined with many other factors, socioeconomic factors being especially pertinent. So the car spawned an entire culture, and firearms are virtually a way of life in our very rural area. AdMech embody this phenomenon, so they have a tendency to, this tendency of man to elevate machines far past their station that might otherwise be granted by their utility alone. This sort of holiness in our own culture is reflected in how we depict the AdMech, right? How we mythologize the AdMech. And this is again the reduction to the absurd of mythologies of Barth. So objects as commonplace as the bolter or pictor are endowed with actual divine potency here, actual tangible spirit. So they carry meaning far beyond their practical use, just as our machines do today. And we all love our trucks and whatnot. Uh, and I think this is actually a deeply human affectation for our post-human cyborgs. Another one that we reach for very frequently is Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto. It is not coincidental, I feel, that Mechanicus began active development about the same time as Haraway's groundbreaking Cyborg Manifesto. I believe it was just a couple years later. We'll discuss that in greater detail, but it was a catalyst for our use of the Mechanicus as a lens into academia and critical theory rather than as the object itself. So, as in Haraway, the Admech dualism is not a dichotomy. It's not. Heterodoxy is prohibited, but there is a surprising degree of expression available to individuals therein, the tech priests and magos. So they're bound by this common affinity, again, as Haraway's cyborg. And for them, that's the value they place on being human. That's very important. This is a classic Haraway cyborg, and it represents this dual aspect of man and machine, this orthodoxy paired with a very, probably some of the most diverse expression in the Imperium. They have a great deal of freedom in how they express themselves. So, in a sense, despite having that affinity for the total anthropocentrism, it is also kind of a rejection of human identity in a way because the individual tech priests become closer to their ideal machine via their own designs and their own vision of the rejection of the flesh.
And for a couple of sources and more of the science and technology studies, we are briefly referencing Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions. So one of the main points of the entire setting as we see it is this reductio ad absurdum. So Mechanicus are so entrenched in a paradigm that this calls to mind so other entrenchments in the 40K universe, like the Death Corps of Krieg or Imperial Fists.
Literal physical entrenchment.
Yeah, entrenchment, yeah. And they're so deeply entrenched in this paradigm that they completely lack any approved scientific method, replacing empiricism with other ways of knowing. We can see a paradigm shift for them is explicitly prohibited. So that relates to,
It's heresy.
yeah, it's prohibited as heresy, and Kuhn's normal science is taken to an absurd where their paradigm is so extreme that there's really no possibility of revolution and paradigm shift. And then we also mention against method. The ADMEC, as we were saying, they lack a prescriptive scientific method because it's explicitly prohibited as heresy. This leads to an epistemological anarchy, as discussed in Against Method, and in a way, it's a somewhat cruel inversion of this work, since we see that the existence of one method is stifling, would, according to Faribault, stifle scientific progress. But for the Adeptus Mechanicus, where every tech priest and magos and has their own method, and this anarchic sort of enterprise is completely obviating the possibility of science for them, at least in a consistent fashion. And we noticed that in this vein that one of the primary tensions in AdMech culture is this opposition between maintaining order and the status quo through orthodoxy, and then also simultaneously allowing specific sects and powerful individuals to explore and pursue new knowledge. So we found that tension particularly interesting in showing how they simultaneously warn against the dangers of reckless pursuits and novel research, but then they have figures like Belisarius Cawl who are openly criticized for this anarchic method of exploration, experimentation. Um, and yeah, we'll go try to move on to the next so we can start getting into.
So, anyone who's ever worked a blue collar trade, such as being a diesel mechanic, this will resonate with you. So, chant the litany of unbinding, recite the 12 benedictions, smear the oil of sanctification upon the sacred machine. Only then may it stir. So, that's from the Cult Mechanicus Codex 2015, Tech Rituals for Machine Maintenance. So, this is a very early depiction of the AdMech that we have here. And we're going to call attention to a couple of the visual features that we have here, but I want to read out what we have in terms. I'm not sure if it's
It's
clear
nothing.
that what text we have here, but I'm going to read it out because I think it's pretty pertinent. So, the Adeptus Mechanicus is the guardian body of the Earth's ancient technological past. Its ranks comprise thousands of servants, researchers, and technicians entrusted with the knowledge of the commonly feared old science. Whilst the most senior ranks are permitted to experiment and revise their inheritance, the mundane task of conducting those routine functions which successfully maintain status quo are the preserve of the technomats. So technomats do not require any special training because all of their knowledge is implanted directly onto their cerebellum by means of a conductive mesh called an electrograft. The electrograft completely changes the recipient's personality and memory. This has the effect of enforcing the technomat's loyalty as well as programming the servant with the selected information. Unfortunately, the electrographs tend to degenerate in time, causing memory loss, personality disorders, and even mental breakdown. I reiterate, this is how diesel mechanics are trained. So let's take a look at this image here. This is the first depiction of the Adeptus Mechanicus from the first Warhammer rulebook in 1987. So check out their white coats here, right? We have their white coats, they resemble lab coats. And critically, they actually appear mostly human. So they're referred to here specifically as technicians. They engage in mundane maintenance tasks. These are the guys changing oil filters, right? This depiction of the technomats suggests that the AdMech exist more in service to the machine, right? They're not necessarily in communion with the machine, and they are not the masters of the machine. So there is much less direct representation of transhumanism or posthumanism conceptually or aspirationally here. We've replaced some flesh with steel, but not much. So there's kind of a juxtaposition as well as look what they're carrying. So the sensor is still present today, right? We see that in much more modern depictions. But we have the really primitive looking sensor here and this augmetic eye, right? So they establish this aspect of the AdMech aesthetic, and it does persist to this day. Both of those things are still present. What is notably absent, however, are the very opulent and impressive qualities of the Catholic and Orthodox religious traditions as a common visual reference in many depictions of both the Imperium and AdMech and contemporary 40K media. Specifically, they are actually described as ascetic and depicted as tonsured, which is a practice, right, associated with monastic life.
In exploring this early depiction, we'll read the quote first. It says, The Magos unfurled the machine's limbs with a flourish, each piston hissing like incense. The congregation gasped in awe as if witnessing a miracle. So that's from Priest of Mars 2012. So, in considering this juxtaposition that we pointed out of old technology and new, we thought that the AdMech invoke this Renaissance phenomenon of theater of the machine. So we have here in the image a woodcut by Giovanni Branca from 1629 in a book called Le Machine. And this particular woodcut is commonly said to depict a steam turbine or a steam engine, but it's not technically precise, and Branca was commonly unsure how these devices that he depicted would work in real life. We found that parallel clear with the AdMech, as many of their depictions of machines are imprecise, and for a great number of them, they are also unclear as to exact details of how these technologies function. Branca's machine bears some resemblance to the Aeolipile or Hero's engine, which is devised by Hero of Alexandria. Um, but I found in particular this inclusion of a man's head to indicate where the steam would be blowing toward the paddle wheel is a bit strange, whimsical, and an odd kind of skeuomorph. So I thought it was odd to describe a man's head as a skeuomorphic feature, but I also saw this as a direct linkage to the Adeptus Mechanicus outlook, and in saying that if the flesh is weak, then the flesh is obsolete and man himself is an archaic technology. Um, we also see the Adeptus Mechanicus constantly exhibiting a theater of machines. They have XY gantries that are completely dedicated or solely dedicated to ringing a bell, which you see in the Space Hulk Deathwing game. And there's that tremendous fondness for candles, incense, gears, buttons, screens, with no apparent function outside of ornamentation. It's clear that they probably know how to light a space or should know how to light a space. But they hello? Okay. Um, but those things have no apparent function outside of ornamentation. And um, the they insist on these inferior forms of lighting for religious and aesthetic reasons. We also thought, just to briefly connect it, that it was reminiscent of Tanazaki's In Praise of Shadows, where he directly addresses the topic of holistic lighting as pertinent to an entire aesthetic. So this segues into our consideration of machines as mythology, since much of the importance for the Adeptus Mechanicus here is the ideological weight of the machines and their facets rather than just their function. For them, technology is strongly mythologized, so the ritual of praying over a bolt gun, for example, is not primarily important because of the function it serves in making the weapon perform better, but can be seen as more serving this function to inscribe the weapon within the mythological order. And of course, like it does work, this praying over the bolt gun, because of the machine spirits, but the necessity of every aspect of ritual is definitely debatable. Here we're looking at a depiction of Coriol Zeth by John Blanche from the 1980s. I couldn't find an exact date or attribution, but it's one of the common images that circulate of her, and she's featured in the Horus Heresy Mechanicum in 2008. So we're just going to briefly consider, with the splitting of the Mechanicum that occurred during the Horus Heresy, we could say it's an example of two opposing models of science locked in battle. So we have someone like Zeth, who controversially rejected belief in the machine god and believed in pursuing knowledge outside of the constraints of the orthodox Mechanicus doctrine. And then we have, in opposition, Kelber Hall, who is the fabricator general of the Mechanicum, and he can be seen as prioritizing ritual, secrecy, and allegiance to the machine god over discovery. So in this way, the death of Zeth can be seen as the AdMech's project of rational mastery collapsing into mythic dogma, going back to the dialectic of enlightenment, where science becomes theology, reason regresses into myth and authoritarianism. So this is a pinnacle moment, and it forever alters the trajectory of the AdMech as well as many other aspects of the 40K universe. So it's interesting to consider it in that way as part of the overall 40K history. We also consider the characters of Coriol Zeth and Dahlia Cythera as hinting at different possible cyborg futures in the Haraway sense. So, as a Mechanicum character, Zeth is notable because of how her female identity is foregrounded. She is referred to by she, her pronouns. She uses them, and this is emphasized in her as part of her individuality, which we don't see as much later on, particularly, especially in the face of her orthodox adversaries. And then we have Dahlia Cythera, who is notable as a hybrid with liminal qualities. So when she is helping to build the Akashic Reader, she becomes imbued with memories of the Dragon of Mars. And it's strongly suggested that this relationship connects her to an expansive kind of post-humanism, since it said that there would be access to, quote, the sum total of knowledge itself. So these possibilities are quashed with the death of Coriol Zeth and the takeover of the Dark Mechanicum at the end of or during or after the heresy.
One of the things I'd like to point out just before we move on is we seldom see depictions like this character anymore. I think that there's been a consistent, despite the push towards, more representation, there's a stark desexualization and a removal, right? This kind of flattening of the characters into one mold. So we don't really see this depiction anymore. It's kind of an important way that it's changed. And so we'll move on to the video games. This is something that I do engage with from time to time. I've played Rogue Trader, and Mechanicus is a great game. So the modern video games offer a nice contemporary representation of the Adeptus Mechanicus, but they encourage the player to negotiate these dogmas for themselves. So Mechanicus being a fun example. So the Mechanicus, it presents conflicting characters. So you've got like Kepra, she's very pragmatic, Videx, who's very dogmatic, and Scaevola, who's a researcher who doesn't really care about either of those things very much. So, but we present them through their portraits, okay? We obscure their physical bodies. So their physical bodies are occulted, and so those portraits they kind of displace Haraway's concept of physical hybridity, and they displace it onto their ideological differences. So you have the cyborg otherness that is so characteristic of the faction is expressed not through their machinery, but through their constant complaining and competing interpretations of Mechanicus dogma. So that kind of erases their traditional identity markers like we have today, like gender, like race, and socioeconomic status, that sort of thing. So we'll focus for a second on Videx. I didn't put a picture of him in here, but he's one of the coolest looking characters in the setting. So he's literally called a Lector Dogmatus. And he's another excellent illustration of Adorno and Horkheimer and the regression into myth. So the AdMech does not regress from instrumental reason so much as it operates entirely outside of it. Their myths are functionally true in their universe, right? They are real. So the game presents this as kind of an audio-visual liturgy. So it's a soundtrack of sacred chants and machine sounds. Go to YouTube and look up the Mechanicus soundtrack. It's awesome.
Yeah.
And it immerses the player in the world view. It places the player in this context. So you become complicit. The player becomes complicit. And that is kind of the final theoretical element here. By following Videx's religious hectoring, and then you go and you perform the game's rituals, you actively participate in this myth. So Warhammer in general is very good at this. It's superb, actually. This is the setting which makes us feel sympathetic to Fabius Bile. It subverts the notion of freedom fighters in the form of the Gene Stealers. It makes us complicit in things we aren't entirely comfortable with. That you are complicit in this is this is what completes that regression into myth. So we'll also we wanted to address this a little more, but the admech of the abominable intelligence connects directly to the contemporary AI anxiety. So in 40K, there really was an AI apocalypse, right? It's just a historical eschatological event. Crucially, the Mechanicus dogma does not allow this to be framed in rational terms, such as AI is prohibited because AI is dangerous. The rational fear is insufficient, it has to be, sublimated into scriptural law. Vedex demonstrates this with this condemnation of alien tech. All prohibitions must be theological, and that transforms a historical trauma into an internal and unquestionable heresy. So, this was a little peek into what we can learn about real world academic topics from just one faction in 40K. I believe that Warhammer is superb as a pedagogical tool. I mean, at least if it can teach me, it must be. Due to the subject matter, there is some inclination, I think, to try to use the material more for primary school education, but it's well suited for exploration of these more advanced concepts. The setting's just littered with theory and art history. It's quite clear that highly educated liberal arts experts have lovingly crafted the setting. There is no other setting which is so widely regarded as by fans as future history, things that have not yet happened, but they will. So I'm grateful for the curiosity that Warhammer has sparked. I'm grateful for the direction given by Sarah that has allowed me to investigate these topics effectively. And we are also tremendously grateful for the chance to present here at this conference. Thank you.